few days later, Leah found out the truth. She caught sight of Officer Daniels outside the grocery store leaning against his cruiser. She walked up to him, arms crossed but eyes soft. "You could have just said something," she murmured. Daniels gave a small shrug, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Would you have let me?" She didn't answer, and he took that as confirmation. "You weren't going to ask for help, so I figured, why wait until you have no choice?" The moment hung between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Leah finally said, "Thank you, not just for the car, for seeing me." Daniel's gaze met hers, steady. "Everyone deserves to be seen, Leah. But you earned this 10 times over." What neither of them expected was how far her story would travel. Within a week, someone from the hospital posted about her 40-mile days on the community bulletin. Local businesses offered grocery cards, a shoe store delivered new walking shoes just in case, and a neighborhood watch group started a volunteer carpool for others facing similar struggles. People she had never met began greeting her by name, telling her they were proud of her. Leah was still the same woman, still working hard, still keeping her promises. But now, she wasn't carrying it alone. And every morning when she walked past her old driveway to the now revived sedan, she touched the hood the same way she used to. Only this time, it wasn't a promise for one day. It was a quiet thank you for the day that had finally come. Set things in motion that didn't require her permission, not because he wanted to ignore her wishes, but because sometimes the best way to honor someone's dignity was to act quietly in the background, giving them the outcome without the burden of accepting charity. That evening, Daniels and Tom met at Leah's house while she was on her shift. Tom's eyes widened when he saw the sedan up close. "She's been walking because of this?" he said, running a hand over the faded hood. She could have been driving months ago if someone had just looked at it. They worked under the dim light of a portable lamp, replacing the battery, flushing the fluids, fixing the worn brakes, and patching the exhaust. By midnight, the engine turned over with a deep, satisfying rumble. Daniels felt a strange rush of relief, as though the sound itself was a promise that tomorrow Leah's path would change. But the plan didn't end with the car. Daniels had arranged for Carol at the hospital to meet Leah that morning with a new schedule, one that allowed her to start after her kids were safely at school and end in time to be home before dark. No more 40-mile days, no more watching the world through the blur of exhaustion. He wanted her to wake up that morning and realize without having to ask that someone had seen her, really seen her, and decided she deserved more than just survival. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet guess, was how the ripple of this quiet intervention was about to spread far beyond Leah's driveway. Because in less than 24 hours, her story would travel through the hospital, into the neighborhoods she walked each day, and eventually into the heart of a community that had been watching her for years without ever truly seeing her. In the ignition. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her mind a tangle of disbelief and suspicion. Then she turned it. The engine roared to life with a deep, steady hum that filled the air and seemed to fill something inside her too. Leah pressed her lips together, swallowing hard as her vision blurred. She hadn't heard that sound in over a year. As the engine idled, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked neatly under the wiper blade outside. She stepped out, took it, and unfolded it. The handwriting was simple and firm. "No one walks alone forever. A friend." There was no name, no explanation, but somehow she knew exactly who had done this. Leah's drive to the hospital that morning felt surreal. The 20 miles that had taken hours to cross on foot passed in less than 30 minutes. The streets she had memorized step by step blurred into a continuous ribbon of motion. She arrived at the hospital entrance just as the first blush of sunrise spilled across the sky. Carol from housekeeping was waiting near the side door holding a new schedule. "Leah," she said warmly, "we've adjusted your shifts. You'll start after your kids are at school now and finish earlier in the evening. This way, you can be home before dark. No more doubling your trips." Leah tried to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She managed only a nod before hugging the paper to her chest. Word of her car's return and the change in her schedule spread through the hospital faster than she could have imagined. By lunchtime, people she barely knew were stopping by the break room to smile or pat her shoulder. That evening, when she drove home, she noticed something she hadn't expected. Neighbors who had once simply watched her pass were waving, some calling her name, others just smiling with a kind of recognition she wasn't used to. I don't mean to pry, but I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's caring more than they let on. I can see this walk isn't just about getting to work. There's something else here. For a few steps, she said nothing. Then, without slowing her pace, she let out a long breath. You ever have to choose between keeping a promise and saving yourself? She asked, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Daniels frowned slightly, unsure where she was going. I promised my kids, she continued, her voice low but firm. Promised them I'd never let them go through what I did. She glanced sideways at him, measuring whether to go on. When she saw he wasn't pushing, she spoke again, her words threading into the rhythm of her steps. I used to have a car. A good job, too. Then my youngest got sick. Real sick. I had to miss shifts for doctor appointments, hospital stays. Boss said he understood, but one day the understanding just ran out. I lost the job, then the car. We were weeks away from losing the house. I was working anywhere that would take me, cleaning houses, stocking shelves, but it wasn't enough. Then I got the call from St. Mary's. Night cleaning shifts, steady hours, just enough to keep the lights on and food in the kitchen. Only problem was the bus doesn't run at the hours I need. The hospital's 20 miles away. It was either take the job and walk or... She trailed off, but Daniels didn't need her to finish the sentence. He waited, letting the weight of her words settle in the cool air. So, you walk, he said quietly. Leah nodded. Every day. Because if I show up late, if I miss even one shift, that's it. No more job, no more house, and my kids. Her voice broke slightly, but she swallowed hard and steadied herself. They've been through enough already. They don't need to see me break. Daniel's gaze dropped to the tote bag she carried so protectively. Sam, what's in the bag? He asked gently. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She opened it just enough for him to see. Neatly folded inside were 2 small lunch boxes, one blue, one pink, each packed with sandwiches, fruit, and a single chocolate cookie wrapped in wax paper. For the kids' lunch at school, she said. I stop back at home before they wake up to leave it on the counter. Then I head right back to the hospital for my shift. That's why it's 40 miles a day, not 20. Daniels felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold air. 40 miles, every single day. No one in the neighborhood she passed knew that the woman they barely glanced at was walking enough miles to cross a small state each week, all to keep a promise to 2 children sleeping in a small house on the edge of town. She didn't ask for help because she didn't believe she had the luxury of asking. Her pride wasn't arrogance. It was armor, the only thing keeping her going. By the time they reached the hospital, Daniels knew this was no longer just curiosity. He couldn't go back to simply watching from a distance. Leah had built her life on a razor's edge, and one bad day could send it tumbling. As she disappeared into the side entrance, her shoulders squared and her head high, he stood there in the crisp morning air, feeling the pull of a decision he knew he would have to make. This wasn't just her burden anymore. Not if he had anything to say about it. A plan in motion. The morning after Leah's quiet confession, Officer Daniels drove his patrol route as usual, but his mind was far from the hum of the engine or the calls coming through his radio. Leah's story had settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. He kept seeing her in the dim light, walking with that steady, unbroken pace, the lunchboxes nestled carefully in her too. Oat! Her pride wrapped as tightly around her as the sweater she wore against the cold. He thought of her children, waking up to find their lunches ready. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag, her grip tightening ever so slightly. I'm headed to work, she replied simply, her voice steady but not unfriendly. She didn't stop walking, so he fell into step beside her, keeping enough space to give her comfort. At the hospital, right? St. Mary's? He asked. She nodded but didn't offer more. The silence between them wasn't tense exactly, but it was weighted, as if she was waiting to see whether he was just making conversation or digging for something deeper. "You ever think about catching the bus?" Daniels ventured after a few blocks, his voice careful. "Or maybe there's a carpool from your neighborhood." Leah let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Buses don't run early enough for my shift," she said, "and carpools aren't much good if you've got no one to ride with." She glanced at him briefly, then back at the road ahead. "Besides, I don't mind the walk. Gives me time to think." Daniel studied her face in the muted glow of the street lamps. There was no complaint there, no trace of self-pity, just a quiet acceptance, the kind that comes from living with circumstances so long that they've become part of the air you breathe. But he also saw something else in her eyes, a vigilance, like someone who knew that if she faltered even for a day, the fragile balance of her life might collapse. They walked together for nearly a mile before Daniel spoke again. "You've got quite the route, 20 miles, right?" She hesitated, and for the first time her gaze shifted to meet his fully. There was a flicker of surprise there, perhaps at the fact that he knew the distance. "Something like that," she said finally. Then she slowed her pace slightly and tilted her chin toward him. "Why are you following me?" The question wasn't hostile, just direct. Daniels chose honesty. "Because I've been wondering why you do it. Most people wouldn't." He paused, then added softly, "And I think there's more to it than just getting to work." Leah's eyes held his for a long moment, the mist beating in her lashes. Then she looked away, back toward the road. "Everyone's got their reasons, officer. Mine's just mine." Her voice was even, but there was a faint tremor at the edges, like she was keeping something carefully guarded. Daniels didn't press, not yet, but as they reached the familiar corner near the bakery, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever she was holding back, it wasn't small. And if he could get her to trust him, the truth might explain not only the miles she walked, but the weight she carried every step of the way. The weight she carried. The next morning, the rain had given way to a brittle, pale light that washed the streets in a muted gold. Officer Daniels positioned himself in the same spot as before, but this time he didn't stay in the cruiser. He stood on the sidewalk outside Leah's home, leaning casually against a telephone pole, coffee in one hand, as if he were simply part of the scenery. He knew she would notice him immediately, and she did. The front door creaked open at exactly 4:00 a.m., and Leah stepped out in her sweater and patched sneakers, the tote bag slung over her shoulder like always. Her eyes met his for a moment, not in surprise, but with the resigned acknowledgement of someone who knew persistence when she saw it. Without a word, she locked her door and started walking. Daniels fell into step beside her, neither of them rushing the silence. They walked through the sleeping streets, past the man with the shopping cart, past the shuttered store, past the sagging porch where a tabby cat always sat watching the world. Leah's pace was steady, her breath visible in the morning chill. Daniels kept his questions at bay until they reached the midpoint of her rows, when the quiet between them had softened into something less guarded. "Leah," he began, his tone careful. The route wound through several distinct worlds in the span of an hour. First the neglected neighborhoods, then the modest residential streets where working families lived, and finally the affluent stretch with gated driveways and manicured hedges. Daniels could see the subtle shift in Leah's posture as she entered that last stretch. It wasn't that she hunched over or sped up, but there was a tightening in her shoulders, a deliberate choice to keep her gaze level and not react to the people who glanced at her from behind their tinted car windows. When a woman walking a small white dog crossed to the other side of the street at the sight of her, Leah's pace never faltered. Daniels felt a faint sting of anger on her behalf. By the time they reached the busier part of town, Daniels could tell she was moving a little slower, not from exhaustion exactly, but from the sheer accumulation of miles. Yet there was no hesitation, no sign she might turn back. She passed the bakery again, the playground, the boarded storefronts, and finally, the hospital. He watched her slip through the side entrance, greeted by the same security guard, and disappear inside as though the miles behind her didn't exist. Daniel stayed in his cruiser for several minutes, staring at the doorway she had just entered. There was still so much he didn't know. Why no bus? Why no car? Why such a relentless distance day after day? And what was it in her tote bag that she guarded so carefully? His instincts told him the answer would be something he didn't expect, something that might change the way he looked at not just Leah, but the quiet perseverance of people he passed every day without a second thought. He decided then and there, tomorrow, he wouldn't just follow her. He'd find a way to speak to her without making her feel cornered. Because if she was carrying a burden that heavy, it was time someone knew its weight. The first conversation. The following morning brought with it a heavy sky, the kind that looked like it had been stitched from layers of gray wool. Rain clung to the air in a fine mist, dampening everything it touched, and the streetlights cast blurred halos in the fog. Officer Daniels sat in his cruiser a few houses down from Leah's home, sipping coffee from a paper cup that had long since gone lukewarm. He had decided the night before that this would be the day he finally spoke to her, but he knew he needed to do it carefully. People like Leah, people who had learned to carry their struggles quietly, didn't often welcome strangers poking into their lives, especially strangers with badges. If he came on too strong, she might retreat entirely. If he was too casual, she might never open the door to her truth. This was going to require the kind of patience his job didn't always encourage. At exactly 4:00 a.m., the creak of Leah's front door broke the stillness. She stepped out wearing a light rain jacket over her sweater, hood pulled low, her tote bag slung securely over her shoulder. She locked the door in that same careful way and began her walk, shoes making soft slaps against the wet pavement. Daniels let her get a block ahead before easing his cruiser forward. For a while he just followed as he always did, watching the subtle ways she navigated the morning world, nodding to the man with the shopping cart again, stepping aside for a cyclist, pausing briefly under a street lamp to retie her shoelace. Her pace was unbroken, but she wasn't in a rush. It was a kind of steady defiance against the 20 miles she faced. About 40 minutes into the walk, Daniels made his move. He pulled ahead of her, parked on the side of the road, and stepped out into the mist. Leah's eyes flicked to him immediately, cautious but calm, as if she'd already assessed. At 100 possible reasons a police officer might stop her. "Morning," Daniel said, keeping his tone friendly but neutral. "I've seen you walking this way a lot. Long walk for this time of day." By the time she reached the edge of the hospital district, Daniels found himself thinking less like a cop on patrol and more like a man trying to solve a puzzle with no obvious pieces. He parked his cruiser in a side street, watching as she disappeared into the side entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, nodding to a security guard who seemed to know her well. Something told him that her story didn't end at that doorway, that the real reason for her 20-mile walk was buried beneath layers of quiet dignity she didn't wear for sympathy. And as he sat there, engine idling, Daniels made up his mind. Tomorrow he wouldn't just follow her to the hospital. Tomorrow, he would find out where her journey began, the beginning of the road. The next morning, the sky was still ink black when Officer Daniels adjusted the brim of his cap and leaned against his cruiser at the far end of an unlit street. He had gotten up earlier than usual, skipping his normal stop for coffee, determined to trace Leah's journey from the very first step. Something about her had planted a seed of unease in him, not suspicion in the criminal sense, but that gnawing kind of curiosity that comes when you sense there's a story no one else is bothering to hear. The streets in this part of town were quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the rattle of a loose shutter in the wind. Most of the houses looked tired, their paint peeling, their yards more dirt than grass. He stayed far enough back in his vehicle to avoid catching her eye when she emerged from her home, but close enough that he wouldn't lose her in the dark. At precisely 4:00 a.m., Leah stepped outside. She closed the door softly behind her, pulling her sweater tighter against the chill. In the dim glow of the single porch bulb, Daniels noticed how carefully she locked the door, checking it twice before tucking the key into her pocket. Her yard was overgrown, the fence leaning in several places, but there was a kind of order to the small potted plants that lined the cracked concrete path. As she passed the rusted blue sedan in the driveway, her hand brushed over its hood in that same familiar gesture Daniels had seen before. It was like watching someone greet an old friend who couldn't answer back. She didn't look around before starting her walk, didn't seem aware of the eyes following her from a distance. Daniels eased his cruiser forward, keeping 2 blocks between them. They moved through the sleeping neighborhood, past a cluster of homes where dim light flickered behind curtains, probably early shift workers like her, and into the more neglected side streets where potholes swallowed the yellow lines and abandoned houses sat like open wounds. At one point, Leah crossed paths with a man pushing a shopping cart filled with plastic bags. She greeted him by name, and he tipped an invisible hat in return. Daniels caught that, filing it away in his mind. You didn't know someone's name like that unless you passed them often, and Leah clearly walked this road enough to know its people. As the blocks slipped by, the air shifted from the cool dampness of dawn to the faint warmth of approaching sunlight. Daniels found himself noticing the small ways Leah conserved her energy, the way she shortened her stride uphill or hugged the inside of the sidewalk to avoid puddles. This was not someone testing herself for sport. This was someone rationing her strength because she needed it for the long haul. He watched as she paused at a vending machine outside a closed convenience store. She didn't buy anything, just adjusted the strap of her tote bag and pressed on. The watchful eyes. The sun had begun its slow climb by the time Leah crossed the midpoint of her walk, its pale gold spilling over rooftops and turning the thin morning mist into a soft veil. The rhythm of her steps was steady now, each one measured but unhurried, her breathing even despite the distance already behind her. She had learned long ago that the only way to make 20 miles bearable was not to think about the miles at all. Instead, she let her mind wander, sometimes to the memory of her children's laughter when they were still toddlers, sometimes to the dream of a little house with a small fenced yard where they could run without fear. She thought of the future in fragments, like tiny lights she had to hold on to in the darkness. It was in these early hours, when the world was neither asleep nor fully awake, that Officer Mark Daniels often began his patrol. He had been with the department for over a decade, and his morning route took him through both the wealthy neighborhoods with manicured lawns and the working-class streets where cars sat idle in driveways because their owners could no longer afford repairs. For the past few weeks, he had noticed the same figure moving with quiet determination along the sidewalks. A woman in worn sneakers, shoulders squared against the wind, her face calm but unreadable. She was there before the buses started running, before the coffee shops opened, always alone, always heading toward the city center. At first, Daniels had assumed she was out for exercise, but the sheer consistency of her appearance, rain or shine, weekday or weekend, made him curious. He began noting the time and place where he would spot her, realizing she had to be covering a staggering distance each morning. He also noticed that she carried no bag except a small canvas tote, and that she never stopped to talk except for a brief exchange with an older man tending his garden. Most people didn't notice her at all, their eyes locked on phones or car windshields, but Daniels had been trained to see what others missed. And something about this woman's quiet, uncomplaining stride stirred a question in him that he couldn't shake. Where was she coming from, and why was she walking this far? That particular morning, as Leah passed the weathered park bench near the old bus depot, Daniels slowed his cruiser just enough to keep her in view without drawing attention. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He knew too well how it felt to be on the receiving end of suspicion. Instead, he hung back, letting the distance between them create the illusion of coincidence. She walked past the bakery where the smell of fresh bread curled into the air, past the school with its playground still empty, past a row of shuttered storefronts whose windows reflected her solitary figure. There was no hesitation in her pace, no glance over her shoulder to check for danger. It was as if she had made this journey so many times that the world around her no longer dictated how she moved through it. Daniel's curiosity deepened as he noticed the way she seemed to guard the tote slung over her shoulder. It wasn't large enough to hold much, but her hand rested against it every so often, a protective reflex he recognized from people carrying something important. He wondered if it was lunch, or perhaps a uniform for her job, neatly folded to keep it clean. As she crossed into the busier part of town, car horns and the distant hum of traffic filled the air, yet she moved as though insulated from the noise, her focus fixed straight ahead. The long walk. Leah's alarm rang in the darkness long before most of the city stirred. The soft metallic ring was so familiar that she didn't even flinch anymore. Her hand found the clock and silenced it almost by instinct. She sat still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the shadows of the small bedroom. The old curtains let in no light, only the faint sound of crickets in the damp grass outside. Her 2 children were asleep in the room next to hers, breaths slow and steady, wrapped in mismatched blankets. She didn't wake them. Leah moved through her morning like a silent machine, pulling on her faded jeans, a sweater with thinning elbows, and the same sneakers she had worn for years. The soles were patched in places with black electrical tape, and the laces were 2 different colors. At the kitchen table, she ate toast that had more air than bread and drank coffee made from the last scoop in the jar. She didn't check her phone. She didn't have one anymore. By 4 a.m., she stepped out into the cool air. The streetlights hummed faintly and the road stretched ahead into darkness. Her breath came out in little clouds, 20 miles, every single day. She didn't think about the number anymore. Her body just knew the rhythm. Step after step, block after block, until the hospital rose in the distance like a promise. She passed the old car in her yard, a faded blue sedan with weeds growing around the tires. "One day," she whispered, as she did every morning. "One day, I'll get you fixed." She spoke to it like it was an old friend who understood. Then she began her walk. By the time the first gray light touched the sky, Leah had already covered several miles. She passed the grocery store, the boarded-up gas station, and the diner where the smell of bacon always made her stomach tighten. Some people she passed every day. Mr. Johnson, an elderly man with a Garde, and waved from his yard. "Morning, Leah," he called. She smiled back. "Morning, Mr. Johnson." But in certain neighborhoods, her presence wasn't greeted with smiles. Curtains moved. Eyes followed her. A woman pulled her child closer. Someone muttered something she didn't catch. Leah kept her head up, eyes forward, feet moving. She wasn't walking for their approval. She was walking for her children's future.